Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Paymar, and you are listening to The Big Shift, the podcast that looks at the seismic changes our world and our country confront. Today, we're exploring the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The war between the two nations didn't begin in February 2022 with Vladimir Putin's so-called special military operation to seize Ukraine and absorb it into Russia. It began back in 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea at the southern end of Ukraine on the Black Sea coast, which is a major shipping hub. Since hostilities began in 2022, an estimated 500,000 Ukrainian and Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the war, and at least 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have died in this conflagration. This war seems to know no end. Putin recently proposed a ceasefire if Ukraine gives up the eastern part of the country that Russia controls. That's about 20% of the nation. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has called the proposal absurd. Joining me to discuss this horrific war and its tragic consequences is Carl Larson. He's a U.S. Army veteran who served in Iraq. He volunteered and fought for 4.5 months on the front lines in eastern Ukraine as part of the International Legion of Ukraine. Carl, thanks so much for being with us today.
Glad to be here, Jim.
Carl, you live up in the Seattle area. I lived up there a long time ago. You work in digital marketing for a large accounting website. What compelled you to travel to a war zone in Ukraine to join up with the Ukrainian military and risk your life to help defend their homeland?
Well, it's a great question, Jim, and one that I get asked pretty regularly. First of all, I'll just mention I'm not Ukrainian. I don't have any Ukrainian ancestry. I don't speak Ukrainian or Russian, and I'd never been to that part of the world. When the Russians invaded in against all predictions back in February 2022, I really felt that this was an all hands on deck moment for democracy. And I could see that if Russia succeeded in Ukraine, that there was going to be really a nightmarish number of conflagrations of conflicts happening around the world as a result. The most obvious would be China and Taiwan. And so, as you mentioned, I have a certain set of skills and know my way around conflict zones. And my plan was to become either evacuating civilians or to work in logistics or train Ukrainian soldiers. And
when you arrived in Ukraine, it was shortly after the war began. Putin had massed hundreds and hundreds of tanks in a column. I saw the video, on the television news, and he planned on smashing Ukrainian resistance. And the effort was to advance to the capital of Kyiv, take over the country. But it didn't quite turn out that way, did it?
Yeah, no, it didn't. And thank goodness. And I think the main reason is that Putin, as a dictator, as the richest man in the world, and as a dictator, he's surrounded himself with yes men who have told him what he wanted to hear. And they told him that the Ukrainians were sick of the Zelensky government, and most of them wanted to be able to speak Russian, and that they would welcome the Russians with open arms. And of course, in reality, that's not what happened. Thank goodness.
Well, despite having no prior connection to Ukraine, like you said, you feel it's the world's obligation to help the Ukrainians defend their democracy and contain Russia's aggressive militarism. But many Americans, including ex-President Donald Trump, would just as soon close the door on Ukraine and give up on the country of some 40 million people in the center of Europe. It makes no sense. Why?
It's unfortunate, but Ukraine has fallen victim to internal partisan politics here in the United States and also overseas. It's really indicative of the major partisan split within our own country. I've heard that the United States is described as more divided now than at any time since the Vietnam War, and I think that's accurate. People have other priorities, and they're angry. They're really angry about the southern border or the price of gas. They fall victim to pro-Russia propaganda that says, well, you shouldn't be spending this very small amount of military aid on Ukraine's budget. Instead, that money should go to whatever is your personal priority. I mean, Russia is very good at propaganda, right?
Oh yeah, disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories. They're expert at that. In the beginning of this war, it seemed that Ukraine was in a state of total chaos. Missiles were raining down on the major cities. Armored convoys were pushing toward the big cities. The Russians were executing civilians. Millions of civilians were fleeing the country into Eastern Europe. It looked like Ukraine was going to fall for a while, but it didn't. How did a much smaller country with a military that was supposedly unprepared for a total attack fend off Russia's military might?
And it's a great question, and one that will be studied in military academies for a long time, because especially in the beginning, before the real floodgates of Western military aid opened, Ukraine was very much unprepared and ill-equipped. You know, their military went from 250,000 soldiers to over 1 million in the course of 2 months. And they're still not very well equipped, based on the conversations I have with the soldiers over there. Nowhere near as well equipped as I was as a U.S. Army soldier 20 years ago when I went into Iraq. But the reason they were able to defend their country is because of the bravery and the patriotism and the really fierce determination to be free and not enslaved of the average Ukrainian. I mean, the average Ukrainian remembers the Holodomor. They remember the artificial famine that killed their grandparents and
Millions.
millions.
3 to 5 million
Yeah.
people, I think, died.
They remember being enslaved as part of the Soviet Union against their will. They remember how Stalin treated their people after World War II and how he took a lot of the intelligentsia and sent them into the gulags, you know. I mean, the memories in that corner of the world are pretty
Yeah, they
pretty
go
long.
back a long, long way. They go back to the Tsarist era. Ukraine has valiantly fought back and even reclaimed some of the territory that Russia had gained in the early days of the war in the Donbass region in the east. How were they able to do that with significantly less military force and power?
Ukraine has been successful in certain large-scale initiatives, and then less successful in other combat initiatives. All that. When I was there at the front lines, we were just setting up the front lines, and we were kind of artillery sponges, as we called ourselves. We thought of ourselves as a speed bump, really. If the Russians had really forcibly concentrated on our sector, we wouldn't have held them up for too long, probably.
Yeah.
But fortunately, after I left, the guys, a lot of mechanized vehicles and a lot of drones, actually some air cover at that time, and they were able to take back large swaths of the eastern area south of Kharkiv. And so that was a big win.
Now, the International Legion that you were part of, that still exists, right?
Oh, yeah.
And how many foreign troops are fighting for Ukraine against the Russians? Do you have any idea now?
It's very hard to know. The estimates are somewhere between 2 and 10,000 foreign fighters within Ukraine. The International Legion per se, it's a couple battalions. So, you know, each battalion has roughly 500 guys, right? And when I was there, it was about 40% American, 20% British, and then the rest a big hodgepodge of Brazilian and Colombian and French and German. And it's a little United Nations. And as I understand it, there's been quite a few more Latinos who've come in who speak Spanish. They're great soldiers, by the way. I served with them, very proud to serve with them.
But they're still there. They're still active. Now,
Yeah.
I don't want to guess your age, but, you know, you said you went to the Iraq War 20 years ago, so you're
50.
not a young guy.
No, I'm 50.
They even allow you to fight at that age?
Oh, yeah, of course. My XO, Walter Wood, he is 64, and he will happily march any 20-year-old punk into the ground. He will march with a 50-pound pack on his back. Oh, my gosh, we could not keep up with that guy. So we had a lot of older guys there. Actually, I much preferred serving with the older, wiser soldiers than the young hotheads. As long as, you know, there's physical fitness tests, you know, you got to be able to carry a ruck, at least 10 kilometers and keep up. You got to not have major joint problems. Everything's got to function. You got to be able to shoot, move, and communicate, right? Those are the 3 basic tasks of an infantryman. As long as you can do that, it doesn't matter your age.
A turning point in this war seemed to have occurred in the last 6 months when the Republican Party here in the United States refused to give Ukraine a $61 billion military aid package. I mean, that went on for a good half a year. Ukraine's President Zelensky stated that his country would lose the war to Russia if it wasn't given that aid. The military was running low on shells and bullets. They were saving their bullets. For every 10 shells that Russia was throwing, Ukraine could maybe throw back a couple. Russia was taking advantage of this dominant position. Why, in your view, did the Republicans balk at this aid package? when thousands of Ukrainian lives were being lost and Russia was gaining an advantage. It almost seemed like a political fight. We don't want to give Biden any credibility for helping Ukraine, so we're going to just put up a wall against giving them aid.
So, I mean, it's a good question, Jim. I stick up for Republicans here a little bit and say that the vast majority of Republicans do support Ukraine and support Ukrainian freedom. It's a small minority. It's these Freedom Caucus wingnuts. It's these extremists, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Matt Gaetz, and who really they're just showmen and showwomen. They're grifters, and they're opposed to aid to Ukraine for various personal reasons. But the majority of Republicans did in fact vote for the aid package, and it's just unfortunate that it became a political football for so long.
I know there's the extreme fringe of the Republican Party, but Mike Johnson, the speaker, didn't take this up for quite some time, and the Republicans, the majority of them, as you say, were for aiding Ukraine. They could have overridden the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Matt Gaetzes of the world.
If you look at it from Johnson's perspective, they were threatening MTG tried to do that. They threatened to unseat him, and actually she tried to. She put a motion out. If the Democrats and Republicans hadn't worked together, fortunately it failed, right? But that's because they put aside their differences for 5 minutes at least and kept him in office. Thank goodness, right?
Ukraine has expressed interest in joining NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was formed way back in 1949 by the United States, Canada, and several Western European nations to protect Europe from Soviet aggression. After all, the Soviets seized most of Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, the Baltic states, the Caucasus beginning in 1940, and East Germany as the Red Army marched into Berlin in 1945. Then, fast forward, the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1991, and the former Soviet Republic became independent of Moscow. It's clear that Ukraine wanted to align with the democratic West, not the authoritarian Russians, where their boot has been on their neck for centuries. Some believe this is one reason why Russia invaded. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm sure it was a major part of why Russia invaded. Russia has repeatedly pointed out that they're very firmly against Ukraine and their neighbors in general being part of NATO. And to that I say that's too bad. If Russia's behavior was more of a good neighbor, then perhaps their neighboring countries wouldn't be so desperate to join a defensive pact that guarantees their territorial integrity. And so I have no doubt that Ukraine will at some point in the future join NATO. I will say it is probably not going to happen while they're currently at war. Now, they could join the EU, however, while currently at war, and that's something that the groups I'm a member of are working on pushing.
Well, if Putin and Russia thought that they were going to keep NATO at bay, two new nations have joined NATO. Sweden and Finland have joined NATO now as a result of this war. That whole strategy that he had backfired.
Absolutely. So now they have to defend the longest border they have with a country, as I understand it. The international border between Finland and Russia is 13,400 kilometers. That's 830 miles. So now they have to defend that border, and they have successfully driven these two previously neutral countries into the arms of NATO. If you Google Finlandization, you can see there was a whole policy invented by Finland about how to deal with their bullying neighbor, and no longer. Now they're going to rely on the NATO umbrella.
A slice of Finland today was seized by the Soviets. Finland actually is a slightly larger nation than the map actually shows you today. Russia and the Soviet Union before it has always posed a threat to American interests. Former President Trump recently encouraged Putin to do, and this is a quote, whatever the hell they want to any NATO member country that doesn't meet spending guidelines on defense. How did this conflict become so political and transactional for Trump and his extreme supporters?
Everything with Trump is transactional. That's the first thing you learn on working with him. And his supporters would say that that's a good thing. They believe in that
Mm.
method of international diplomacy. I'm in several Zoom calls per week with Germans and French and other people doing advocacy in Europe, and they tell me that Trump's words went off like a bomb in
Mhm.
Brussels and London and Berlin. Here in America, we kind of just poo-pooed it as, oh, he's just saying something again. It's just another one of his mean tweets or whatever.
Mhm.
But over in Europe, they suddenly were slapped hard in the face with the realization that they can't count on American support. And so in the event of a military emergency, suddenly you have the situation now where the countries of Europe are dramatically ramping up their defense spending. I mean, Poland is spending 4%, 4% of their GDP.
Yeah.
And you have Chancellor Scholz in Germany, he's of the left, right? And now you have pictures of him, touring new artillery factories,
Right.
posing next to artillery shops, which you definitely wouldn't have seen that a few years ago. In reality, it's a good thing that Trump said that.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't the amount of funding supposed to be 2% of the national budget in
Correct.
order? If Poland's giving 4%, I don't know what Germany's giving. Poland's giving double what they need to give.
Poland is one of the countries of the world that most fears Russian aggression, and rightly so. I mean, if the Ukrainians have memories of their grandparents being starved to death by Stalin, the Poles have memories of their grandparents being bayoneted by Stalin's troops
And taken out into the woods and slaughtered.
Yes.
That statement, to get back to what we were talking about, the statement of do whatever the hell you want, that was a stunning admission that he would not abide by the collective defense clause at the heart of NATO if he gets reelected. And what that clause is that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all the members. So
Correct.
what are the 30 other NATO countries supposed to think about America's commitment to the alliance? And while Joe Biden's there, I think they have a pretty good sense that he's behind it 100%. But if Trump gets in January 2025, what's their future look like?
And occasionally Trump tells the truth. He pulls off the mask and exposes his true intentions. And this was one of these instances. In all honesty, Trump's a very transactional person. And in all honesty, Europe could not count on the American military might if Trump's in office, or another president who doesn't care about our alliances. I mean, I'm just being blunt about this. To go last year, I believe it was the Finnish intelligence unit. The Finnish intelligence, they uncovered a Russian plan to destroy NATO. And the way that this would work is Russia would invade a small part of probably Estonia, somewhere in the Baltics, but a traditionally Russian part of Estonia with no towns on it, sparsely populated and populated only by Russian speakers who are sympathetic to Russia, just a couple miles into the Estonian hinterland, right, on the border with Russia. And then they'd stop.
Yeah.
And then they'd wait. And of course, if Trump's in office, he's going to say, well, let's not start World War III over a couple miles of an Estonian cow field. And if he does that, well, guess what? NATO no longer exists.
Where do you go from that 2-mile range into Estonia to its capital, Tallinn? It's not that far away. The nature of this war has changed radically in the 2.5 years of fighting. What started out as a typical war effort, tanks, missiles, infantry, it seems like it's turned into a drone, glide bomb, cyber kind of war. Tell me how things have changed and the importance of high-tech warfare going forward, from the time that you had boots on the ground to talking to your brothers over there in the International Legion.
I mean, it's a very strange war. It's a strange combination of World War I and World War IV, a very futuristic war. So there's a lot of trench warfare, a lot of time spent in bunkers, a lot of traditional soldierly duties in a trench environment. Very little what we call maneuver warfare, what civilians typically call a blitzkrieg. Very little of that. That typically doesn't happen because if you mass your military vehicles, they're going to get bombed. You're going to get hit by glide bombs. You're going to get hit by FPV suicide drones or just regular artillery. So it's a weird combination of this very old school trench warfare and very modern warfare, where both sides' commanders have very good visibility of where both sides' troops are, because there's so many drones in the air. And anytime you try to mass troops for a breakthrough for maneuver warfare, it can be easily broken up by FPV drones and artillery. And so both sides are kind of locked into this static battle. It's called positional warfare. And honestly, the Russians are very good at this sort of thing. They have seemingly limitless supplies of orcs, as we call them. And
Orcs? What does that mean?
well, that's what we call the Russians. We call them orcs. Didn't know that?
Okay.
Yeah.
No. Getting back to the weaponry, it seemed in the beginning this was a major tank battle. There was a big story about Germany selling them Leopard tanks, and
Right.
we were going to give them Abrams tanks, but that seems to kind of disappeared from the news anyway.
Throughout the last 100 years, since tanks, since armored vehicles were invented, it's been a back and forth of tanks versus anti-tank technology. And in the last year, I would say, the balance has clearly swung towards the anti-tank technology. All you have to do is just open YouTube and you'll see hundreds and hundreds of videos of, $1.5 million T-72 tanks being taken out with a $500 FPV drone.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have that happen a couple hundred times or even 1,000 times like they have. The Russians they're furiously building new tanks, but they're also they're reactivating tanks from the 1950s and 1960s. They're just anything that they can, like old tractors they're putting into battle because the Ukrainians just blow them up as soon as they get them on the front lines.
The Russians now have changed the balance of power really in the world. And instead of selling gas and oil to Western Europe, they're now selling it to China and they're selling it to India. And they've built these alliances with Iran. Iran's supplying them with a lot of the drones. The Chinese are supplying them with microchip. There just was this agreement, the other day with Kim Jong-un in North Korea where they're going to have a mutual defense treaty. A lot of this was inconceivable before this war started.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're seeing is a major realignment amongst the world's dictators. The world's, authoritarian regimes are starting to realize that they are outnumbered by democracies. And if they want to continue with their malfeasance, with their shenanigans, with invading their neighbors, they're much stronger if they band together. And so you're seeing he hosted Hamas in Moscow several times, right before and including after the October 7th attack on Israel. And there's many conspiracy theories that he had something to do with it. But the connection between Putin and Hamas and Iran and North Korea and China and Venezuela, and these dictatorships are starting to realize that they should band together. And they present a real threat to the democracies of the West. Even though we're stronger and larger, we tend to be good at being distracted. So that's our job, is to wake people up, right?
Carl, what do you think comes next? Can this war end at the negotiating table with the two sides right now? It seems so diametrically opposed. Or do the two countries just continue to try and outlast each other on the battlefield? What's your viewpoint?
So to answer that question, Jim, I'd like to make a comparison real quick between the current conflict in Ukraine and the Second World War. I think there's a lot of parallels there. In both instances, you have one country stood alone for the first 3 years, and that country's fate was definitely not assured. And Britain in 1941, before we joined the war, and Ukraine in 2024, they're both standing alone and they're both fighting hard, but they're having a tough time of it until they get larger allies to join and do the right thing and step in off the sidelines. And so World War II lasted 6 years. We're only into the third year of this war in Ukraine. And so, this war is going to continue for a while. And as far as negotiating, hey, I'm all in favor of saving lives and negotiating, but you have to negotiate from a position of strength. I mean, you can see that what Putin's demands are. I mean, his demands, not only would Ukraine have to give up its currently occupied territory, but they'd have to give up even two more areas that are not occupied. And then we'd have to remove all sanctions and basically reward Russia for invading their neighbor. I mean, what message would that send to China about Taiwan or North Korea if they decided to do something with South Korea? We have to better support Ukraine is the solution. We have to give them the tools needed to win, not just survive.
Speaking of history, comparisons between Hitler and Putin, I think there's a parallel track. Hitler almost took over all of Europe in the 30s and 40s, and Britain was holding on by itself. I mean, first they took over Austria in 36 with the Anschluss or reunification of the German states in 38. The Sudetenland was kind of given to them. That was the German-speaking section of Czechoslovakia, was kind of handed to them by the British as a way to stop the aggression. And then what did Hitler do? He forged a pact with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, and in 1939, they invaded and divided Poland. In 1940, the Nazis blitzkrieg across Western Europe. Norway, France, Holland, Belgium all fell. And in 41, Hitler attacked the Soviets and almost took over the country. Do you believe if Putin seizes territory in Ukraine, wins in Ukraine, that he'll attack other neighboring countries like Hitler did 80 years ago?
Absolutely. And I think the lesson of history here is that appeasement didn't work with giving up Czechoslovakia in 1938 and in 1938 and 1939, and it won't work in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe in 2024. Maybe Putin will attack, like I mentioned, and take a small chunk of Estonia or another neighboring country, or maybe he will proceed to use unleash his propaganda weapons on democracy, which have been very successful, by the way. And people see his military and the strength of his military, but realistically, I would argue that his propaganda operations are, if anything, more effective in destabilizing and really rotting democracies from the inside, making us fight each other, right? So,
well, how do we stop that? Thousands and thousands of bots and trolls and everything else in cyber warfare, and planting stories on all of our social media, and the Chinese own TikTok, and that's become a favorite of tens of millions of people. I mean, you're a tech guy. I mean, is there a way for us to stop this?
well, actually, I do work in digital marketing, so I work with a lot of social media, and I see it with my own eyes. And I have friends on the left who they're convinced that Trump has no support because on their social media they only see lefty viewpoints. And then I've got plenty of right wing buddies, who they're convinced that the vast majority of people are going to vote for Trump in the election, and nobody would ever support Biden because that's the viewpoint that they see. Right? It's very divisive. I mean, realistically, at the root of the problem is Americans have to give we have to care about something more than just sports and TV and our distractions. We have to empower our elected officials to get more involved and to have commissions of experts to set guidelines and to overcome the hundreds of millions of dollars that the tech companies have put into lobbying to keep any legislation off of them so that they can do whatever they want, right?
Yeah, they're totally unregulated.
Pretty much.
At least with the television stations, they're somewhat regulated. It's not like it used to be with the fairness doctrine, and Reagan did away with that. Getting back to Ukraine for a moment, just looking at the news and reading the papers, it seems like the Ukrainian population has got to be exhausted right about now, and morale must be suffering. Their infrastructure's been destroyed, electric power and water's limited, grain exports, which is a key part of their economy, has decreased. How can their economy survive? They're selling off state assets now, and they're supposedly getting a $50 billion loan from interest on seized Russian assets. But
Right.
do you think this is enough?
Well, I am really concerned about the Ukrainian economy, and I'm frankly really surprised that their inflation has not run away there. When I came into the country in early March 2022, it was 37 hryvnia to the dollar, and now it's 39.5 hryvnia to the dollar, which is really impressive that it's only increased by that much. Ukraine does get a lot of economic support from the European countries, specifically Germany and England. Germany doesn't like to pay for weapons, but they do like to provide economic support. The situation for civilians there is not great. I can tell you with my own eyes, and from conversations with my friends there. I made a lot of friends while I was there. There's checkpoints in every major city. It's if you're a fighting age man, you do kind of worry about going out in certain without any draft deferral paperwork. You got to carry that with you. And you can't, if you're a military age man, you can't leave the country. And so there's it's martial law, there's curfews, economic opportunity is oftentimes limited in some ways. The vast majority of Ukrainian cities have plenty of good running water and electricity. It's if you're talking about Kharkiv, that's a different situation. The cities that are right next to the Russian border, that's very different. And Kyiv is a target of Russian attacks, so they do have rolling blackouts now and then.
But you also have the Russians in control of that massive nuclear power facility. Was Zaporizhzhia, the 4 reactors that they have there, the largest reactor system in the world. That's under Russian control. What if they just switch off the power to the rest of the country? Isn't that been their goal, to demoralize and destroy the ability to live a normal life there? And they've rained down missiles and bombed the industrial infrastructure of eastern Ukraine. It seems like it's a downward spiral.
Well, absolutely, and I'm very concerned, especially about the new suicide drones that Russia is pumping out, thousands of based on the model of the 2400 that were supplied by Iran. Russia is really ramped up and is busy using them to bomb civilian infrastructure all over the country, especially electrical power plants. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, it previously supplied 30% of Ukraine's electricity, and it hasn't been able to do that since being occupied in the beginning of the invasion. The real reason, that's one reason why Russia occupied it. The other is nuclear blackmail. And they're trying to imply that the longer the conflict goes, the more likelihood there is of a nuclear power breach, a nuclear reactor breach that could contaminate the whole country or the whole continent, similar to what happened in Chernobyl.
Chernobyl, yeah, right. When you think back in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had hundreds of nuclear missiles, and they gave them all up. And you wonder how this conflict would be playing out today if they'd kept those nuclear missiles, because Russia has that hanging over their head as the last resort if they were to start losing the battle again.
It's very true. The lesson for every country in the world that has nuclear weapons is don't give them up, because if you do, you might get invaded. So most Americans are not aware, but there's this thing called the Budapest Memorandum. It was in the early 90s, and the United States was a signatory to it. It was signed by Clinton in 1994, and we provided security assurances, and so therefore Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, and it specifically prohibited Russia from threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, or Kazakhstan. So we're actually legally obligated to protect Ukraine. So we don't just have an economic interest in it. I believe supporting Ukraine saves a lot of American money and a lot of American lives. We also have a moral imperative. I would argue supporting Ukraine is a moral imperative, but we also have a legal requirement to do so from the Budapest Memorandum.
A legal requirement that what are we going to do? Are we going to start World War III with Russia if they did use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine? Are we going to fire a nuclear weapon in Moscow or St. Petersburg? That's not going to happen.
No.
We're not going to start World War III. So what can we do? We've smothered them with sanctions. That doesn't seem to be cutting it. We're giving weapons. We're giving military aid. So are the Europeans. And the war goes on.
Well, there's many ways to increase the support for Ukraine and the pressure on Russia. You pointed out that Russia is selling its oil at a major discount to China and to India, and China is probably going to do whatever it wants, but India is susceptible to sanction pressure as a result. In addition, you mentioned that there's $600 billion worth of seized Russian assets. The majority of those are in European banks, and so we passed the Repo Act here, it's called, and we've freed up about $8 billion of that that money, but the rest of it's in European banks, and the same bills have to be passed in those European parliaments to free up that money so that it can be used to support Ukraine. There's many different avenues to support Ukraine. It's not just
there's a lot of reluctance though to start monkeying around with the financial system, and you could erode the support for the system if you start taking funds that belong to one country and giving them to another country. I don't know that there's a lot of controversy around that, but let's switch gears because I'm running out of time here, Carl. When you came back to the United States after serving with the International Legion, you co-founded the Ukraine Defense Support Organization. Can you tell me about that effort and what are the goals of the UDS?
Yeah, so UDS is an organization of about 400 folks, primarily here in Seattle. We've got 63 active volunteers. We've got about 20 leaders within the group, and we've got members all over the country, in St. Louis, in Washington, D.C., in New York City, in Florida, and also in Europe, in Germany, in Poland, in England, and in Ukraine. And we do three things. We deliver equipment, non-lethal aid to the Ukrainian military. So that's night vision, drones, medical equipment, vehicles. I've got an ambulance Humvee parked out in my driveway right now. It'll be
really?
the 13th one. If any former Humvee mechanics are listening to this, we need you. Contact me. And so we supply equipment directly to the military units that are defending freedom in Ukraine. The second thing we do is we advocate to the U.S. government for greater support for Ukraine. So we're part of the American Coalition for Ukraine, which is the big umbrella group in Washington, D.C. And 18 of us flew to D.C. for the fight on the supplemental aid package. And we like to think we played a small role in that huge victory. And then the third thing we do is helping raise awareness, winning hearts and minds to why it's important, why Americans should care about Ukraine. So that's why I'm on the show right now and really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, Jim.
Well, Carl, how do you get the humanitarian aid to Ukraine? And how are you assured it gets to the people who really need it? There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine. No one doubts that. The Zelensky's working on that, and they have their own set of oligarchs. How do you ensure that what Americans and Europeans are putting together in terms of aid packages is actually getting to the people who need it?
Well, first of all, I have to mention we don't do what's strictly considered humanitarian aid. We provide military support, non-lethal military support. So there's a lot of groups out there helping with humanitarian aid or helping refugees, and God bless them. They're doing great work. That's important. But we want to win the war. And so we provide urgent, critical, life-saving tools to the soldiers. And the way we do that is we work directly with the soldiers, and we courier just about everything into the country. We have couriers leaving just about every week, and they deliver the items either directly to the soldiers or they use the internal Ukrainian postal service called Nova Poshta. It works very well. And we get pictures and videos, and we make sure that they got what we sent. I was just talking to a British Legion brother this morning, and he showed pictures of the night vision that we'd sent and gave some stories about how they used them in their last operation.
Well, how do you, let's say you've got this Humvee in your driveway, how do you get that to Kyiv?
We've personally sent, I think, 17 from the U.S., and then we try to buy them in Europe as well. But
how do you get them? How do you get them from Seattle to the thousands of miles?
We stick them in a shipping container, and it goes around. It takes about 3 months, but it's not too expensive.
Wow.
We get them there. No, it has to. With this whole thing going on with the Houthis, it can't go through the Mediterranean.
The Sea of Hormuz is all blocked with the Houthis. Yeah. So
it has to go all the way around, and then it gets unloaded in Poland, and then they stick it on a train and they take it to Kyiv.
Oh, wow. So you've got a logistical nightmare ahead of you, half the time, right?
We've got a ton of people who've been doing this who are really expert. I mean, we're part of this whole organization of group. There's hundreds of Ukraine supporting groups doing this. We're a small operation. If you look at a lot of these groups are huge. They're sending hundreds of millions of dollars worth of stuff. So we've got a very well-defined lane. We're working with the soldiers I served with, and then we've got Ukrainians in my group who have, fathers who are over there serving and brothers and uncles. So we work through trusted partners that we know are going to actually use the equipment. We don't work through third parties or through the government.
I just got to ask you this. It's been 2.5 years of fighting,
Yep.
and American interests, it wanes very rapidly. Do you think America is still concerned about Ukraine? The vast majority of Americans, baseball season's upon us, and the summer is here, and Ukraine is like a million miles away, and
Yep.
let those two fight it out. Who cares? So how are you able to keep helping the Ukrainians from here in the States?
Well, I'm just going to continue to be a squeaky wheel here and remind Americans that we've got summer upon us and we've got a lot going on, and good Lord, there's a presidential election on. There's a lot of distractions. However, there is something very important happening that affects our national interest, and I think it behooves us to look at the paper now and then and perhaps even get involved. So if any of your listeners are interested in getting involved, what my group does better than any other pro-Ukraine group is we put volunteers to work. So, of course, if people want to donate, they can go to the website and donate. We'd love that. But if they want to get involved, we have a lot of Zoom calls. If they're nearby in Seattle, they can come in person. We have a weekly in-person meeting. You can come and wrench on the Humvee in my driveway.
But let me ask you this, though. When you mentioned the word, it's in our national interest. I don't think that most Americans understand what you're talking about when you talk about it's our national interest to protect Ukraine.
Well, there's many reasons why supporting Ukraine and supporting freedom in any democracy is in America's interest. I'll just give a quick summarized couple reasons why. First of all, if we care about not having to rebuild the hundreds of bases that we had to build along the border with the Warsaw Pact, all throughout the 1950s through the early 1990s, then it's in our interest to not allow Russia to conquer Ukraine. I mean, if they conquer Ukraine, we're going to have to rebuild those bases along the Polish-Ukrainian border, Romanian
Billions
border.
of dollars.
Billions, if not trillions, exactly. And
Yeah.
then the next thing is, China is looking at this situation and trying to decide what they're going to do in with Taiwan and then with the Philippines. And if China invades Taiwan, that's going to result in thousands of American sailors ending up at the bottom of the South Chinese Sea, and probably trillions of dollars of money spent on military hardware that's going to be used, and an enormous worldwide economic recession, if not depression. So it's very much in our interest to say, to have a red line saying, no, Russia cannot take its neighbor. No, China cannot take its neighbor. If that's the cornerstone of the whole post-World War II economic international order, is that no, you cannot invade your neighbor and steal their land and enslave their people. If we allow that to be thrown in the dustbin, then every authoritarian country around the world is going to look at their neighbor and say, well, if Russia could get away with it. And so if we don't want the world to be plunged into more chaos and more conflagrations, then we need to nip this in the bud in Ukraine.
I totally agree with you, but I just don't think the country club set is thinking about it as they sip their cocktails. I know you're not a military strategist, and you don't have intelligence from agencies like the CIA or the NSC or the DIA, but from what you do know from your time in Ukraine and the contacts that you keep in touch with in the International Legion, what do you think is the future of Ukraine?
Well, I think the future, they're going to have to go through some short-term pain as they're doing, but I think the future is very bright. The country is very full of entrepreneurs, very hardworking people. The average Ukrainian is as honest as the average American. It's some of the older government officials and people like that, and the oligarchs who give the country a really bad name. And I really think it's got a bright future. If you look at the natural resources of Ukraine,
right?
It's a huge country. Like you said, it's got 40 million people. I
think it had 50 million at one time.
It did, yeah. Well, those people will come back once it's freed from Russian domination. I think it has a really bright future, and it's going to join the EU. It's just they have to free their country, and we have to help them do it.
It's going to be a very long slog, I have a feeling. Now, what happens if Western support for Ukraine wanes? under a Trump administration, and the West doesn't continue to send them military hardware as well as economic aid, how long can they possibly survive, no matter how brave they are, no matter how they're willing to sacrifice? Russia has nearly 4 times the population, a very large military industrial complex, and Putin will not give in unless he can gain a victory of some sort. He's even using Chechen fighters now, which were their arch enemies, as well as prisoners and mercenaries. He is not going to give in.
Yeah, no, he's not. So I mean, anything could happen. Putin could die tomorrow, and and then Russia could descend into a civil war because he's very carefully hollowed out all institutions and not identified a successor. So no one really knows what will happen when he exits stage right.
Mm-hmm.
As far as could Ukraine survive without American support? Honestly, probably not.
Even if Western Europe steps up.
Well, the problem is that Western Europe has allowed their military capacity to atrophy so badly since the end of the Cold War that they're ramping up, but they would have to really degrade their own defensive industries to a major extent to help Ukraine. And I mean, realistically, I'm not as negative about a Trump presidency affecting Ukraine as some folks might be. I mean, Trump did not stand in the way of Mike Johnson putting the supplemental onto the House floor, and thank goodness, So hopefully Trump would continue Biden's policies as regards Ukraine. But if he didn't, and if he just immediately pulled the plug on our foreign aid, then probably things would go very badly for Ukraine in the short term.
He says he can end this in 24 hours, but another bombastic boast by Mr. Trump. In closing, Vladimir Putin said of the Soviet collapse was a genuine tragedy. In his State of the Nation address, he called the collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And it seems that if he were able to regain control and authority over Ukraine, it goes back to that statement I made about Hitler. And if he gets Ukraine, he'll go after Moldova, Transnistria, Azerbaijan. Who knows about the Caucasus? He'll go after Poland, the Baltic states, and it's all a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, the man's hubris has no bounds. Destroy, honestly, the future of Russia. Why did he make everyone around the world hate and fear Russia instead of, say, investing in his high-tech industries? There's a lot of really smart Russian workers. He could have turned Moscow into the next, Abu Dhabi or the next, Singapore or something. He could have really had his country go in a different direction. Instead, his country will be known throughout history as perpetrating death and destruction and rape and murder on their neighbors, and honestly on their own people as well. People into believing that up is down, black is white. Horrific.
There have been people who say, what is Russia? It's a big gas station, gas and oil and building weaponry. Otherwise, what are they really contributing to the world except cyber warfare and chaos, the ability to disrupt elections in other countries? And they're even going after the Paris Olympics. I mean, and they get away with it. The lack of criticism, it's appalling to me. But Carl, thanks so much for taking the time to explain both your military adventure in Ukraine as well as your efforts here in the United States to support Ukraine. It certainly is one of the more noble stories I've heard come out of this awful war.
Well, thank you for having me, Jim. It was a pleasure and a privilege, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Well, that was Carl Larson. He's the co-founder and president of the Ukraine Defense Support Organization. And the web address, if you'd like to know more or get involved, it's ukrainedefensesupport.org. That's all one word, ukrainedefensesupport.org. If you want to know more about it, get yourself involved and maybe play a role. Carl, thanks again.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Jim.
Okay, I'm Jim Paymar, and you've been listening to The Big Shift, available wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening today, and stay tuned for the next episode of The Big Shift. It's coming soon.